So yeah, thank you so much for coming out tonight. We're really excited to have the event. I'm Pratik Puri. I'm the president of 314 Action at UCLA, and we're co-hosting this event tonight with the Science Public Policy Group at UCLA as well. And both of our groups formed last fall mainly because we were concerned. We were concerned about how science was being represented and utilized in the government, and we wanted to gather members of the campus community and see what we could do about it. And we think discussions like we're going to have tonight are a great place to have those conversations. So yeah, we're really excited about that. So just to give you an overview of the event tonight, we're going to start by introducing our panelists, and then we're going to ask them a series of questions targeted to their backgrounds. And after that, we're going to field audience questions. And if you would like to submit a question, either please post it to our Facebook Live or Facebook event page, or you can tweet them at 314 or hashtag #LabToBallot at 314 Action UCLA. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our moderator for tonight. He graduated with a PhD in population dynamics from UC Davis, and then realized that comedy was his true calling, and he's been doing that ever since. He's been covered by the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and many other publications. Please give a warm round of applause for Tim Lee.
Thank you, Pratik. I'm happy to be here. Just so I can get to know a little bit about the audience, but just by a round of applause, how many people here are not scientists? Okay. Hands in the air. You guys do not follow instructions very well. All right. All right. Now, how many people here are scientists? Scientists explicitly raised their hands after I told them not to, so I'm going to do what they want. Strong-willed people. All right. Well, it's interesting. I actually had to come up from San Diego. I took the train up. I've been working on a show about global warming, so I wanted to minimize my carbon footprint. And I got to stop by USC. Spent the day, a little bit of time there. It's a beautiful campus. I was actually working on a crossword puzzle there, and when I finished, the English department gave me a master's degree. So now I'm on the faculty there. That's what we call pandering. Since we're talking about politics, I think we better get used to it. So anyway, I have enjoyed seeing scientists get involved in politics, and I can't wait to see more of that happen. And I think it's a very hot topic. So I will start introducing our panel. Let's see, first, put my glasses on so I can read again. Jess Phoenix, you are a volcanologist running for Congress in the only Republican-held district in LA County. Her research has been featured on the Discovery Channel and with media coverage of her campaign, including the Washington Post, LA Times, Gizmodo, and CNN. Her campaign focuses on issues such as gun-related violence, healthcare, and environmental regulation. Welcome, Jess Phoenix. Edward Walker is a sociology professor at UCLA whose research focuses on the politics of social movements and grassroots organizing. His book, Grassroots for Hire, Public Affairs Consultants in American Democracy, won the Charles Tilly Award from the American Sociology Association, with media coverage including the New York Times, Time, Washington Post, and The Atlantic. Welcome, Edward Walker. Mr. Walker was also a Texas Ranger at one point in time. Scientists just now getting that joke. Jamie Tijerina, a community activist working directly toward the advancement of science, the arts, and community through her work as a scientist and through her involvement as an elected official in local government through the neighborhood council system in Los Angeles. She is the lead organizer for 314 Action Los Angeles County. Please welcome Jamie Tijerina. Alex Bradley is a molecular biologist at UCLA who, alarmed at the growing prevalence of policy being made counter to scientific consensuses, organized and led over 50,000 attendees in the March for Science Los Angeles Earth Day 2017 event. He continues to serve as the MFSLA organization's communications director and is an advocate My glasses aren't good enough anymore. And is an avid advocate of scientific diversity, literacy, and funding. Please welcome Alex Bradley. It is a very diverse group that we got here, so I will get right into the questions. And the first question, we can get, I can get this functioning, will be directed to Jess. You were studying volcanoes and now running for Congress. What inspired you to make that change?
Thing on? Oh, there we go. Okay, so I decided to run for Congress because as scientists, we work in the world of facts. We deal with reality and we use reason and logic to eliminate uncertainties about the world around us. And the work I've been doing has largely been focused on communicating science to the public, educating the next generation of scientists through my nonprofit, and learning more about the world around us through studying volcanoes, both active and extinct, and putting things in the context of natural hazards of all types. That is good, but it is not good enough when you have an administration in power that does not value science. And one of the things that I hear a lot is, science isn't political. Why are you running for office? You're a scientist. And I said, well, you know what? Science is inherently political. It is political when a government decides what it's going to fund, when it decides what its priorities are, what is worthy of being studied or researched or investigated. When you have a government that does not fund those things, you are making a statement as a society that you do not value science. So therefore, it is political. And what isn't political is the scientific method. That is objective. That is how we figure out the closest thing to truth that we can. So I wanted to stand up for truth and for facts, and to show that science is how we advance our society through applying the scientific method to the big picture problems that we face. So that's why I'm here, and occasionally I get to make jokes about volcanoes still, because, you know, geologists rock.
You have to remember that volcanoes and politicians both blow a lot of smoke.
Yeah, there's a lot of hot air involved in both.
And volcanologists are very logical.
Yes, we lava to be logical.
Yeah.
Really bad puns. I have tons.
Right. I'll do the puns here. Edward, why are grassroots movements effective relative to other social movements, and where do they face challenges?
Well, I mean, the contrast I like to think of is, between grassroots movements and more kind of professionalized social movements, right? So when we think of grassroots movements, we might think today of Black Lives Matter. We might think of anti-toxics groups. Something I've been studying is the anti-fracking movement, local women's activism. And what do we think about when we think about grassroots movements? What we usually have in mind is, how do you get people power to win over the power of money, right? It's often more about numbers than dollars. It's about trying to find a way to use limited resources to make significant change. And you can usually contrast that to a more professionalized kind of group that has more funding, more longstanding organization, usually has a bit more staffing. And that usually means that you have more of an insider kind of position that comes along with those resources. And so something I've been thinking about, especially for tonight, is what does it mean for scientists to be involved in grassroots organizing? Because scientists bring a certain amount of professionalism to it. And so there's kind of an interesting contrast between the professionalism that we usually think of as one side of it and the grassroots as the other, when this is about doing grassroots among professionals. And I think that's something that's really interesting that I'm hoping we could talk some more about tonight. As far as what tends to make some groups more effective than others, I mean, one thing that we know is that it helps to know your target when you're trying to generate social change. The famed or infamous community organizer Saul Alinsky, once talked about how an effective strategy, if you're trying to sit in on a corporation's office, is to do something really disruptive. Sit in, blockade the entrance to it. And but when the company starts saying you can sit in the corporate boardroom and we're going to provide you snacks, you're not really a threat as much anymore. So it's really about knowing your target and trying to catch them off guard. Some other things to think about, how do you communicate, right? Can you integrate the kinds of things that you're doing online with the kinds of things you're doing offline? Something that a lot of organizations are thinking about today, especially as you try to bring those two together. And the third thing is, how do you find a way to communicate your message in a way that speaks both to the activists that you're trying to get involved, as well as to the institutions and other audiences that might be observing what you're doing. And what we know about this is that it helps to have a message that really connects with the authentic experience of the people who are involved. for scientists, that means talking about policy in a very evidence-based way. For your audience, it means that they really need a way to connect your arguments to things that they think are truthful and consistent and fit with a broader narrative. So I can say some more about this later, but there's a broader story here about how activism can be used to generate change.
You. And Jamie, what made you want to focus on the local level, and how'd you get involved?
Sure. I mean, I could probably talk for about 2 hours just on that alone. But I grew up in the Northeast and the East Side of Los Angeles, and after grad school, I came home to live full time, and I admittedly was a little culture shocked. There had been a lot of change happening really rapidly in Highland Park and really just all over the East Side and Northeast, and I wanted to find out what's happening, what's going on. And so for me, I had a family member when I was in high school who actually joined the neighborhood council in the area that we were living at the time. And so I said, does Highland Park have one? And of course they did. And a spot opened up on the board, and I decided to put my hat in the ring for it. And it has been a really good thing overall. I mean, everything starts at the local level, right? I think we are all familiar with this idea that small changes over large periods of time mean big change. And all of those small changes happen at the local level in the community. And to really engage locally lets you not only see what's going on, but actually take part in trying to provide information. And sort of, if you see something that is not right, you can actually make a change or make a suggestion that could actually impact people really far down the line. And there's a lot of issues locally that over time play out and really show you that everything is interconnected, right? Like immigrant rights, affordable housing, environmental justice. These are all local things that the community needs to have a voice in, and that affect STEM professionals, because we live in communities. We live with people who are not just STEM professionals. So these things affect all of us. Los Angeles has this neighborhood council system, which really gives a unique opportunity for people to act in a direct advisory capacity to the city council on a wide range of issues, basically anything that the city council is talking about, that they've set up a council file for. And so there's no reason not to join your neighborhood council. There's no reason not to get involved locally. I think too, all of this, at least for me, just in retrospect, now that I'm where I'm at, it seemed like it was probably inevitable for me to get involved, because I don't think that with everything that's happening now and everything that's happened and everything that our East Side communities have been through over really the last century in Los Angeles and through the history of the city, I think that I would have been involved at some point no matter what. So everything starts local.
All right, thank you. Alex, as a graduate student, why did you decide to organize the march, and how did you find the time?
Good question.
All right.
The answer to the latter question is that I have a phenomenal PI, who was very supportive from the beginning. I took a moment to just sit with her in her office after I decided to plan the march, and made sure that she was on board. Established this is going to take a lot of work. I'm likely not going to be able to commit myself to research to the degree that I have and that I would like to, but I think that this is going to be a very important thing to be a part of, and also instrumental in kind of my career development. I have a strong interest in being a part of policy, of positively impacting it, and contributing to more evidence-based policy. And in addition to that, just making good connections very early on. I have no history in activism whatsoever. I just cared very passionately about this, and I think that's a good 90% of it. Is if if you're passionate about an issue, don't be afraid to throw your hat in the ring and do something about it. And so that's kind of why I got involved, is that I have a 15-month-old daughter. At the time, she was not yet born, and I thought from her perspective, if when she's old enough to understand what was happening at this time, she asks me, "Were you a part of the solution to this?" I like to think that maybe I had some positive impact. And as far as finding the time to do that, it was difficult, and I had tremendous help from a lot of people, including Jen Wheeler, who is the program director last year for the march, and she continues to spearhead the event that we're having this year. Lots of people stepped up. I mean, we had a spreadsheet just full of names of people constantly volunteering, names pouring in, with all kinds of backgrounds from non-scientists and scientists alike. And without them, there's no way in hell I could have pulled off what we did last year. And I think there was another question in addition to the time. What was the first part of that?
Why did you decide to organize the march?
Oh, well, I think I kind of answered that.
You did, yeah.
Yeah.
Primarily my daughter. I was very fed up with I still am fed up with the current political climate, and I thought maybe one person who has not done activism but cares very strongly about this can actually matter, and presumably I did.
All right. Oh, so I'll just direct this in general to any of you can take the first shot at this. What skills do scientists have to make them uniquely suited for public office? Actually, I think, Jess, you're the right one to answer the one first.
Okay, the short answer is creative problem solving. And then I have special expertise in that because I am a field scientist. Who here does field research, like out in the field? Does anybody here? Yes, there's one. Okay, there's two of us. We're good. We got this. But yeah, that's the thing is, lab science is great too. Do not get me wrong. I do not want to have you all like throwing lab equipment at me on the way out. But I love lab. You need to do it because you need to process what you've got in the field. But when you do work in the field, and I'm sure you find this in your labs too, things do not go as planned. And as scientists, often you have budgetary constraints, personnel constraints, time constraints. And in the field, it's like, these narco traffickers might not let us get to our sample site. What can we do? Or look, the tire blew out and we're halfway up the world's largest volcano. What now? Our spare is flat. So when you're trying to solve these problems on the fly, you become very good at adapting and solving issues. And of course, that's not even to mention anything about the actual problem you're trying to address, which you have to look at from a variety of angles in order to figure out, how am I going to test this hypothesis? So scientists, because we bring that framework with us, it's a skill set that we can really use very effectively as a political tool when we're looking at all sorts of different issues, whether it's, regulations on, house construction at the local level and, should we allow this per our HOA even, or whether it's all the way at the national level, what should we do about North Korea? These are things where you can use data and evidence and facts to measure what we need to measure in order to solve the problems. So that creative problem solving is absolutely indispensable. And for those of you who haven't tried field science, try it. It will blow your mind. It's amazing.
The way I tend to think about this is that there's been this long-standing assumption that the things that are good for being a scientist are not the things that make you good at being a politician, and that somehow there's this problem. And I'm a sociologist, and Max Weber wrote this classic essay on science as a vocation that gives you one version of this. That what scientists do is work in the realm of facts, and what politicians do is work in the realm of values. And something else he says in this classic piece is that the kinds of things that make you a good scholar or researcher are not necessarily things that equip you to be a leader in society. And I think that's really changing now, and I think there's a lot of problems with that way of thinking. Certainly we're seeing some major changes now in the area of science communication. Scientists are increasingly being trained in how to communicate about their findings and about what's important about their research to broader audiences. I mean, if any of you have applied for a grant to the National Science Foundation, there's this broader impact statement that you have to write that talks about why your research is important to the broader society. There's programs now like Compass, the American Association for the Advancement of Science now has a Mass Media Fellows program. And then there's all these science communication programs at places like MIT, Boston University, Johns Hopkins. So now there's a lot of work to kind of bridge not only science in the policy area, but also science and journalism. And I think that's really breaking down a lot of these barriers in a really helpful and productive way. And I just want to agree entirely with everything that Jess just said in terms of being evidence-based in your research, I think gives you a certain skill to be evidence-based in some other areas as well.
Yeah, I think Jess touched on this also in her first answer, that it's really the scientific method that's not exclusively to be applied to research in the lab or in the field. Like that's how we should do policy. You should take a question, an important question, find the components of that question that aren't known, determine a logical, straightforward way in which you can obtain those data to address those unknowns, and then move forward with policy. That's essentially your hypothesis. What is going to be effective in resolving this problem, and then you collect data following that policy implementation. And if it doesn't work, then you go back to square one and you redesign your approach. And that's not happening. Like at every level, that's not happening. We aren't looking for the important questions. Rather, we're allowing special interest groups or to lobby for the dismissal of the question or for covering up the questions. We're not forming evidence-based policies to approach these issues. Rather, we're allowing whoever has the greatest sum of money and influence to determine what that policy is going to look like. And that's it's in the follow-up too. There's no constructive data analysis. There's no attention to facts. It's just which opinions and beliefs that we have that don't necessarily line up with the truth do we equate to facts so that we can implement the policy that we want to in the end. And that's just something that if you're a decent scientist, I think the scientists in this room can attest, you can't, at a fundamental level at your core, you can't conscionably allow policy to be implemented in that way. So I'm confident that people like Jess, should they take office, are not going to allow these trends to continue. So I think it's incredibly important that both scientists and science-minded individuals follow the scientific method in approaching policy.
I'm going to avoid repeating what everyone else says and just understand that I agree.
Thank you.
But I want to also say that I think in general, scientists are very patient people and persistent people when it comes to doing their research, because you don't just say, I'm going to have this hypothesis and then tomorrow I'm going to do my experiment and then the day after I'm going to write a paper and then it's going to get published and it's going to be great and it's only going to take a week. That's not how it plays out. We all know that. Same with just the education level that you have to attain. It takes a lot of grit and persistence and the ability and resilience, really. And policymaking takes all of the above. It's a process. You don't just hop into a neighborhood council meeting or a city council meeting or whatever. You're like, here, I have this policy proposal, and everyone's like, yeah, I agree, it's great. It doesn't happen like that. There's a lot of stuff that happens in between, a lot of talking to people, listening to people, collecting information from people, seeing what they think, getting rejected, having to change whatever your proposal is. It's really a process, and it's not that unlike the research that you have to do day to day. So yeah, those are I think that patience, resilience, and persistence that scientists have is critical to policymaking.
All right. What about charisma? Scientists have the charisma to be politicians?
I think so.
All right. Let's throw that in there. Jess, it seems like we live in an age where facts can be ignored at convenience. What's your approach to selling skeptics on research and scientific findings?
So I find that, as somebody who has actually studied climate change and I work on natural hazards all the time, people will accept that you can say, yes, volcanoes erupt. You can't really deny that one. But the fact that we've got people now who are pushing back and saying the Earth is flat again, I mean, I don't even know whether to take that seriously, that whole movement, because it's a little shocking. But with climate science, there really is that whole sort of genre of folks who say, it's totally natural, and therefore humans have nothing to do with it, and it's unavoidable, and it's cyclic. And you also have people who say, well, I just don't believe any of it. And then you have people who do say, yes, I believe that humans contribute to climate change. So I've dealt with the whole gamut of it, and ever since I was teaching at Cal State LA years ago. And what I've found is really, really effective is to find why people hold the beliefs that they do. So that means it's not so much a convincing process as it is a listening process, and a questioning process. So you basically say, okay, you believe the Earth is 6,000 years old. Why? And then you wait. Shut up and you wait. And you listen to what they say. And if they say, well, my religious text taught me this, or my friend told me that was the truth, or, I have this conspiracy theory that dinosaurs aren't real and the government planted them. Okay, I've heard them all. And so then I just go a little bit deeper and I say, okay, well, are you familiar with the Grand Canyon? And do you know how floods work? And you start to just ask them questions about the things that that we have proven with science. And then you start to at least, I don't think you solve the problem. You don't resolve their doubt necessarily. But what you do after some time, if you're engaging logically and you're talking to them, like, you respect the fact that they are another person. And you're not lording over them with your advanced degree or what have you. You're just saying, okay, so why? Like, tell me why. Then you can start to open just like a little crack in the door, and that lets a little bit of light in. And I think that's how we make progress. You're never going to convince somebody who has an extreme ideology about anything through one conversation. It doesn't happen that way. But it's asking people, where their beliefs come from, and then sort of getting them to question their own belief system in a non-threatening way. And yeah, there are definitely some people I want to be like, you're completely wrong. But I really try hard not to do that, because that is never how you communicate effectively. You can never communicate with someone if you're coming at it from a position of conflict. You have to come at it from a position of being a scientist, saying, what can I learn here? What can I accomplish? And that is greater understanding. And you're only going to understand more if you seek more information, get more data. So that's what I try to do. And it's not, doesn't work 100% of the time, but it definitely allows me to have civil discussions with people and to get people thinking and to spark their curiosity again about the world around them, and to sort of step away from the dogma that they may have.
So are you saying the Earth is not 6,000 years old?
No, I mean, it's kind of sad, isn't it, right? Like, I mean, wouldn't it be cool if we were all just like, boom, bam, here we are. But no, I'm sorry.
But I read that on Facebook.
It's the internet. It must be true.
All right. Edward, how can grassroots movements avoid preaching to the choir? And what are the avenues through which such movements can respectfully engage citizens not in their base?
This is always such a big challenge for any cause for social change, right? I mean, how do you sort of reach outside your existing base? And one of the distinctions I like to think about is the distinction between mobilizing and organizing. So mobilizing is you've got the people who already agree with you, and you can get them to do something usually short term. So you can get them to show up at a protest event, you can get them to sign a petition, you can get them to put a post up on Facebook. And that's usually, relatively low-cost thing to do, and those people already agree with you anyway, so it's not very hard to get them to do that. But I like to think of that as, it's sort of like chasing the sugar high. It's like, wow, you can get a lot of people to do that, and it feels really exciting. But are you building the long-term organizational infrastructure that you need to make significant social change? And that's where organizing comes in. Where organizing is really about, trying to figure out, what are people's real concerns and interests. Sometimes you come into a conversation not having a strong agenda or a certain outcome in mind, and you just talk to people about the concerns that they have and try to build toward a broader political movement on the basis of that. And I think that's one of the things that there are lessons for people who are involved in causes like the ones that we're talking about tonight. There are lessons in other causes that can be used to understand how to build long-term organization rather than just doing mobilizing. Grassroots low-income community organizing does a lot of this, especially the model for getting outside your own base is interfaith community organizing, which does a lot of this. They try to build on the basis of religious congregations, which have a lot of pre-existing organization, but then they try to bring together people across diverse faiths and try to find common ground. And it's hard work, and it takes a long time. And the issues that they will go after are really broad and diverse. They will be working on healthcare one day, the next day it might be immigration. It might be something about mass incarceration or crime-related issues and so on. in the campaign after that. So the good and the bad of it is, I mean, you can build long-term power for people, but it's kind of that can go in many different directions. But I think that's how democratic politics can often work pretty effectively.
Alex, there are so many avenues to take to make a difference. Why did you choose organizing the march?
Because as I established, I had absolutely no history of activism or any anything that I knew. Like how do I what's the action I can take to produce this change? And I think when the kind of frustration had brewed to its peak inside me about the lack of evidence-based policy, it just seemed to coincide perfectly with the inception of the Science March in Washington. So there was a group that was kind of spread out, but they decided to have a March for Science in Washington. And this initially private Facebook group just blew up like overnight. It exploded. And I was at lunch with a buddy of mine who's actually in the audience, Eric Torres. We were having lunch, and I was, I'm sure, annoying the hell out of him, just constantly complaining about politics. And he gets this notification from a friend of his inviting him to join this group. And it seemed beyond coincidence. If there is a higher power, then that higher power was telling me to do something. Because it just happened right as I decided, like, I need to do something. So as soon as I got back to my lab after lunch, I started the Facebook group for Los Angeles to have our own March for Science, and then that blew up as well from there. So that's really why I chose to organize the march, because that was the opportunity that presented itself. And the second question was how to translate.
Yeah, how do you translate that energy into something tangible?
Yeah, so that's I think that's honestly the most difficult question at the heart of all of this. Is you've got a lot of people that are riled up that are discontent with a lot of components of the system, and how do you take that energy, that frustration, and turn it into something tangible? I don't know that I really have the answer to it. What I will say is that I think there are two subgroups. There's the fast, more immediate, and short-lived change, and I think that's what a lot of groups are chasing. I think that's what I was chasing initially. You want people to show up, you want them to be mad, you want them to march, and you want this immediate change. Like everyone in Washington says, "Oh my God, they all care about science. Let's just change everything." And that's not how it's going to work. But that's you kind of need that goal to have the fire under you to actually make it happen in the first place. But people, they make their signs, they buy shirts, they show up to the march, they feel better, and that's for a lot of people. I think that's where they think it ends. They go home and maybe I'll catch the next march. So that's the more pessimistic look at it. I think the longer term effect, which took me a little while to maybe see a little more clearly following the march, is that you have I think most importantly, you're fundamentally from the ground up changing the way people look at things, and that starts with the education, the science education of our youth. And I think not to get into anything too specifically political right now, but I think as evidenced by the Parkland High School kids, these kids you see in their voices, you see in their you hear it hear in their voices, see in their faces that they're not buying into the bullshit the way that a lot of adults now. They've grown up in the age of social media. They've grown up in the age of fake news, and they're not going to stand for it anymore. I've seen several of them stand toe-to-toe with politicians that they shouldn't be intimidated by, and they're not, because it's a very important issue that they're currently championing. And I think that is evidence that doing something like a march, bringing awareness of issues like this, of the lack of science and policy, is just really important. I won't take up too much more time, but there's one volunteer that's worked with the March for Science from the start. Her name is Sandra Huang. She happens to be on the live stream. She's going to hate that I just mentioned her name. But she essentially identifies identified herself when she came on board as a school mom. Like, I'm not a scientist. I don't know how I can help, but I want to. And, she couldn't have been more wrong. Several people couldn't have been more wrong that started volunteering with this group and thinking that because they weren't scientists that they couldn't affect change. She's done so much for us. And she noted the other day that her son, in his AP U.S. history class, they decided to discuss important events that have happened that affected necessary change. And the class as a whole, without the prompt of her son himself, decided to talk about the March for Science. And that just kind of gave me goosebumps to know that these kids of their own accord are saying that was important, that this is something that for the rest of their lives they recognize, like, we can't go against it. We can't just give in to fake news. So I think that's how you transform it. By getting
Jamie, often national legislation dominates headlines. What are the benefits of focusing on local issues, and what do they typically look like?
Sure. So I think I said before, it's like local, everything begins locally. And locally, you can start the conversation one-on-one with people and get them thinking. And sometimes, those conversations, you might not realize that a conversation that you're having is something formative for someone else that can inspire them to do, to take the next level in their action. Some of the local issues really affect people individually on a micro level and then reverberate throughout the community. Immigrant rights is something that I work on in depth, especially after we had a local father who was detained by ICE while he was taking his kids to school. And that has a massive effect. First off, it affects the family. Then it affects their school. Then it affects other families who might be now afraid to take their kids to school because it can happen to them. Then, it's just a massive disruption in the fabric of the community. And crime starts going unreported because people are afraid that they could potentially be detained themselves if they report a crime. And it's just a snowball effect. And so acting on the local level really just takes everything to where it's working on things at the point at which they began. That's just one example. We can talk about climate change, right? Like, everyone talks about climate change, but it's not like everyone was just sending heaters up to melt the ice caps. That's not how it went down. It was small changes over long periods of time that created climate change. And so when you work on that locally by getting people to change their habits or educating them about recycling or telling them, hey, maybe don't use those straws, those aren't good for the environment, and getting them to make those decisions long term, that's just one way things sort of play out.
Jess, how do you balance issues of concern to your district with politics at a national level?
Well, I think it sort of follows on from what Jamie was saying. Things that are of importance to people at the local level are of importance to people at the national level. I'm like many of you probably, I've moved around a lot. I've lived in 10 states and 3 countries, and it is startling, actually, to see how many people have the same issues, regardless of where they live. And so in our community, it's northern LA, my district. And for those of you who don't know, it's Simi Valley, Porter Ranch, Santa Clarita Valley, and then all the way up to Lancaster and Palmdale, and then even further east towards Lake Los Angeles. So it's this huge, sprawling district. And if you ask someone in Simi Valley what they have in common with somebody in Lancaster, they might kind of look at you blankly and say, I don't know. Most people don't even know where their congressional district boundaries actually are. Ours just happens to be so sprawling because of the process we have for roping in people together and calling it a district. It's not scientific or mathematical, as I'm sure some of you know. And California's not as bad with gerrymandering as some places, but really the only tangible link we can find throughout our district is horses, and that's a really weak one at best. They're really, just, you could be living in a block of apartments in Lancaster and you're like, horses? That has nothing to do with me. But you will find more rural focuses in our district than you do in, say, over in Mid-Wilshire. So it's our issues range from everything from rooster ordinances, which are actually more relevant in, urban settings now than they ever have been, to, issues with wildfires. And of course, even folks in Burbank and La Crescenta had to deal with wildfires this last year, pretty bad ones too. Our district, we had the Sand Fire 2 years ago, and then now we had the Rye Fire, and we were next to the Creek Fire and the Thomas Fire. So these are things that, anybody in the country, you say, do you know where you live, what your natural disaster is? And a lot of people say, oh, it's flooding, or it's tornadoes, or it's earthquakes, landslides, tsunami. It can be any one of a variety of things. You just have to find what the issue is for that specific place. So with our district, that's what I do. I say, okay, well, everybody here needs healthcare just like everybody else needs healthcare around the world. That's a universal thing. And so what you have to remember when you're running for a federal seat is that it's the people at home who send you there. And those are the people you need to be accountable to. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of politicians forget these days is that, yes, your big donors are nice, but if you really take a grassroots approach, you're reminded every day that the people at home are the people with the problems that you were sent to DC to solve. So, and then these problems, then they apply to people all around the country in slightly different ways. So you have to make sure that you're always open again to new data so that you can incorporate that into the way you tackle problems.
Rooster ordinances are more important now than they ever have been.
You don't even understand.
I don't.
The Acton Agua Dulce Rooster Ordinance meeting was a trip. And actually, it's amazing. People get really, it's like, if you want to pack a city council meeting, tell people it's about roosters. I am not joking. So.
I'd like to be there.
Yeah.
Edward, many people are here tonight because they want to start a grassroots movement, something that you're very familiar with. What's the most important factor for grassroots movements to be successful? And in particular, what do you think the science to politics movement should focus on?
Well, usually the people who study this find that there's three sort of major factors that help to determine or at least shape the extent to which a social movement tends to be successful. One has to do with how effectively can you exploit the current political environment that you're faced with. One of the major stories to come out of the civil rights movement was one of the things that we know from that time is that the Democratic Party was in an unstable place at that point, right? Because you had white Southern segregationists exiting the Democratic Party in droves. So the party system is then somewhat destabilized, and then those parties are then a little bit more receptive to outside influence. What we know also is that times of divided government in which you've got one party controlling Congress and another party controlling the presidency tend to also be opportunity moments. Some people thought that was part of the story of why the Tea Party was effective when it was. And maybe some of this will change, depending on the outcome of the midterms. Certainly that would seem to be an opportunity if the Democrats take one or both houses. So the political part of it's one part of the story. Yeah, the other one goes back to that issue I was talking about before in terms of how do you build effective organizations. To the extent that you can mobilize your people's resources, and by resources I don't just mean money, I mean people's energy, people's capacity to contribute something to the cause. How can you channel that effectively? That tends to be another factor as well. The third has to be, how can you get a message that really resonates and connects with people? I don't tend to believe that it's just a messaging story where if you just get the frame right, then everyone will, sign up and be on board with your cause. It's really about the combination of finding that right message that can exploit that political moment that you find yourself in, as well as build from the organization that you have or that you'd like to build. And so for scientists, one of the things that comes to mind for me is that there's a lot of community-based participatory research in which scientists are already engaging with local communities. You see this around environmental issues a decent amount, where scientists who study environmental pollution might partner up with a local community who's studying how much particulate matter is in the air, and so they can have a sense about how this might be affecting themselves and their family's health. And so those partnerships already exist, and so I think we're starting to see some scientists who are willing to kind of work outside their normal comfort zone, sort of get outside the lab a little bit more, so to speak, and to engage in outside audience work. And I think that's really important. Importantly, though, I think what I'm talking about here is sort of evidence-based engagement that's not necessarily partisan. I'm not really talking about like a partisan style of engagement, but one that really involves like how do you use scientific knowledge, expertise, and skill to bring an evidence-based perspective.
And has evidence-based stuff become partisan? Is that?
Well, I think that's a concern that some have now. There's I think that was some of the discussion that was coming out of the March for Science on some level too, which is does this make it seem as if science is a more progressive or left issue? I mean, I was reassured with some of the experimental evidence that I saw come out of this afterward, which found that people weren't any more or less trusting of scientists afterward. But I think some people were concerned that might have been one of the outcomes. But most of the evidence that came out of that suggested that wasn't.
Okay. Jamie, what are some current issues being addressed by local councils that necessitate or can benefit from STEM perspectives?
I think really neighborhood councils in general on any issue can benefit from a STEM perspective, because we really do need diversity of thought when we have these governing boards. Just the way that, again, as we were talking about what skills scientists have that might make them suited for public office. I think it just kind of goes back to that, how we look at data, because at meetings, people hand us all kinds of data. Like, they need to come in prepared with information. And sometimes, as a STEM professional, I definitely have said in meetings, like, hey, you need to come back with this data because I'm missing this. I can't make a decision without it. So just being able to look at any issue and really understand what to look for before you make your decision, that's really important. If we're going to talk about STEM issues specifically, I touched upon before environmental justice. Again, all of that is very much local. And we've taken stances because neighborhood councils are advisory on things like the power plant, the Grayson power plant that is in that they're proposing. I think housing and development. I think that's an issue that absolutely could benefit from the STEM perspective. Not only just because you need to look at data, but also because a lot of major research institutions like UCLA, where we're here now, are in really high rent areas. And that can impact somebody's decision to attend school or to continue pursuing their STEM education. And so we need to look at how some of these issues can have effects that we're not initially thinking about. I know there is a neighborhood council effort, Westward Forward, that seeks to get more representation from this area, from the school, from the students, from the stakeholders on issues that pertain to Westwood. And I think it's really important that we look at why those movements start. And I think, STEM professionals can really add to the conversation about that.
Alex, what type of career options do people in science have for getting involved in politics? And where do you plan on going yourself?
There aren't a whole lot that are very straightforward. Traditional tracks to kind of bridge a STEM PhD to a policy position are more, you either go into industry or you go into academia, you establish yourself as kind of a household name in your respective field, and as you become relied upon for high-level consultation, you then maybe decide to transition into a sort of policy role. That's changing, that is evolving, but not very rapidly. The only opportunity that I'm aware of that's very compelling is AAAS offers what's essentially a postdoc or postdoctoral track position that places you into a group in Washington to do some policy work. I think it's typically for a year, and then you can get kind of brought back on for an additional year. And then you can pretty easily, if you've done a good job and you like what you're doing, transition into a full-time policy role. But their cohorts each year, I think, are on a scale of like 10. So there are not an overwhelming number of opportunities for someone who wants to transition into policy out of a STEM PhD. Where I see myself going, I think for practical reasons, I'm unlikely to pursue that option. Having recently started a family, organizing the March for Science was relatively wearing. It's not something that takes a small amount of time, and neither is high-level policy work. So it's something that I think I'm too passionate about to not at some point intersect with policy again in my career path. But at this time, I'm not strongly considering.
Thanks.
Oh, one other thing I wanted to mention is that someone who, a good friend of mine, Andrea, I've written down phonetically her last name because I don't know how to pronounce it. Hajikiriakou. She worked with us and she actually ran our social media last year. She's continuing to aid in managing the social media team for March for Science. She got placed into an industry postdoc at Novartis in Boston, and she actually, I know working with March for Science has opened a lot of potential policy doors for her. She's still very interested in policy, and she, through ASBMB, American Society for, can someone help me out? That's the one.
There we go.
She recently attended one of their conferences and applied for like a grant to go out to Washington to work for, I think it's a week to meet some people. And then one of the stipulations provided by ASBMB is if you take part in this program, when you go back to wherever you came from, you need to then do some other political activist thing at the local level. So they're really trying to stimulate opportunities like that. Most of the larger science.
All right. Well, the AABMB guys party pretty hard. I've heard that.
Oh yeah.
Jess, what's the most advantageous part of bringing a scientist perspective to public office?
Ooh, I would say we sort of have a credibility as scientists, which I think is still there, in spite of the current administration's best efforts to make it otherwise. And this credibility is helpful when you're talking to people because you can draw on facts and evidence. You go, look, I have statistics, I have data, I have sources. And, of course, certain people will want to decry your sources no matter how great they are. But I think as scientists, we're really good at going, oh, no, I don't just have one source, I have 20 that show that same thing. And then you also have the ability to say, well, let's just try it. It's an experiment. And people say, oh, we're just going to try it. Okay, we're going to see what happens. And I think that people are open to things when you say, look, I have reasons for believing what I'm putting forth here, or I should say not necessarily even believing. The word belief is such a complicated one because people want you to believe in science or not. And I'm like, no, it's true whether or not you believe in it. But people want to know that you have substance behind what you're saying. And that substance is not, lobby dollars or big donor dollars, or just because you want a career having power. They want to know that as a scientist that you're there and you're trying to bring some objectivity to the conversation. And then I also like to tell people that the really amazing thing about being a scientist is that with new evidence, I will change my mind. And that is actually what we need from our lawmakers. So I think that having people in office who are willing to reevaluate their positions based on evidence and facts, that is going to be a huge, huge asset in public service as a scientist.
What about if that conflicts with the interests that you're representing in your local?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think at that point, what I've heard from a lot of people is that, and I get this from folks who are Republican, and they say, I don't agree with you on everything. I really don't.
Yeah.
But I like that you will look me in the eye and tell me why you're standing up for that position. And I think that's what people want more than anything. They know that they're not going to agree 100% with any politician unless they themselves are the one running for office. So I think if you make that clear to people and you say, look, I'm doing this in good faith. I'm doing this because the evidence is showing me that we need to go in this direction. And, you want to make sure that as much as you can, you are acting in a way that is true to how you've presented yourself. So if you're a candidate or an official who has assumed that office or run on a platform of evidence and transparency and facts, you need to keep doing that. And I think that you're never going to make everybody happy. Lincoln was right with that whole thing. It's not so much fooling or not fooling, pleasing people, fooling people. You're never going to make everybody happy. And you're going to make some people happy most of the time. And you're never going to make everyone happy all the time. That's not a real thing. So what you have to do is be true to what you really believe in. And you've got to be in it for the right reason. And because I think that really comes across to people versus being in it for self-aggrandizement or money.
Two good reasons for me. All right, this one is going to be addressed to everyone. For people with STEM backgrounds who want to get involved in politics, where can they start?
I think for me, it's about finding a place to engage locally. And if you look at a lot of social movements, even when the issues are really distant from you in your immediate life, you can find ways to be involved in a very important local way. I mean, look at the student anti-apartheid movement on university campuses in the mid-1980s, right? I mean, it seems like this faraway issue. University students are saying, how can we fight apartheid on our college campuses? Oh, it turns out that our universities have investments in all these companies, and those companies have have investments in South Africa. It turns out we can actually protest our universities to try to get them to divest. We're seeing similar things happen now on campuses around fossil fuel divestment. We saw that back in the anti-Vietnam War era, where consumers were saying, how can we fight against the companies that are involved in the war? It's like, oh, it turns out Dow Chemicals, the one that's behind napalm, oh, they make saran wrap. Well, let's boycott saran wrap. And these are small actions, but they're really important actions. And there's a lot of different ways that people can get involved in their immediate environment. And I think that that's true in a lot of these issues as well, where scientists can really engage with local communities. And partially it's about communicating about your research, but partially it's about kind of getting outside that and engaging in the outside world a little bit more as well.
I think I sort of touched on this pretty more specifically with my last answer, but yeah, I think just finding something that you feel passionately about enough that it doesn't matter what your experience has been. It didn't matter for me. I was very passionate, and I figured out how to do it.
I think showing up, like literally just pick an issue. It doesn't have to be very obviously connected to STEM, but pick an issue, show up, find something that you enjoy doing, and think about what you're good at, and find out where you can contribute that skill. If you're short on time, sending emails to the right places. For example, you can send a public comment to a council file online, and that'll get to LA City Council. And it can literally be one sentence opinion on what you think of whatever that topic is. Again, I chose to get involved in the neighborhood council system. You can show up to your neighborhood council meeting and literally just listen and find out what is happening in your community. Like showing up is the biggest thing, and sometimes just listening and knowing what's going on is the first step, and it could actually be a lot more important than you realize. Because if you don't know what's happening, you're not going to be able to really sort of formulate any kind of opinion that is accurate on the situations that are happening in your neighborhood.
I didn't answer yet. That's good. I like when we go out of order. Okay, so let me make a little pitch for somebody who's actually a candidate. Volunteer for candidates. And actually, let me tell you, I'm not saying who, I'm just saying.
No self-interest here.
But I will tell you something that most people don't know, and I'm going to throw a statistic at you, because you're scientists, a lot of you, and you can handle it. Only 0.58% of American adults donate politically. 0.58. So you want a 1% to blame for some issues we've got. Those are the people who are actually selecting the people who get into office. So for those of you who are Americans or green card holders, donate to candidates. And this is, I'm not saying give them, a check for $2,700 or, if it's a state level, more than that. Don't do that unless you can, and by all means do. But if you can't, $5. I'm not even joking right now. $5 actually helps candidates move along, because what it does is it shows that they have a broad base of support. That actually that's what a grassroots movement is. You don't have to live in the district for the candidates to contribute to them. You don't have to know them. You just have to say, I like what they stand for. And you're making a statement with your money, and you are helping to push candidates into office who are going to listen to regular people, who are going to listen to scientists, who are going to listen to evidence, and not just lobbyists. So I think, volunteering obviously is your no-cost way of doing it, but then you have to devote your time. But you can also, donate. I mean, it shouldn't be this way. We really need to have publicly funded elections, so we don't have to have candidates turning into, shills for themselves. But that's where we are right now. So the reality of the facts on the ground are, if we don't get more than 0.58% of our population donating, the 0.58% are going to continue to control who gets a voice in the conversation. So that's a way that you can get involved, that most people are afraid to ask for money. Don't be. particularly if you are working on behalf of a candidate or a cause you believe in. Tell your friends, tell your family, tell your neighbors, tell your colleagues. Say, this matters to me and here's why. Because telling people what matters to you carries way more weight than any commercial ever will. So use your voice and speak up.
Has social media made politics less expensive since you can?
No. The race I'm running in 15 years ago, the amount of money I've already raised would have been more than enough to win the race, essentially. Right now, it is about a tenth. Maybe a tenth? Yeah, about what I need. So I don't know. It's just sad how much money is in politics right now. And you probably heard the race last night in Pennsylvania where the Democrat just eked out a win. The GOP poured in $10 million into that race. What could you guys do with your research with $10 million? I don't even want to think about it. It makes me a little, okay.
Right. This one, again, I'll just put it out to the whole panel. When did you see something you were doing that made a difference?
Don't make me go again, because I just, somebody else.
I mean, there's been a few things where I have actually seen things happen. Not very eloquent, but back in December, there was a challenge called a Lawmaker Challenge, where you basically you had a chance to make a policy proposal. And one of the city council members would pledge to actually make some kind of motion around that proposal. And I won that competition, and that was for getting equitably scheduled city council meetings. And that actually is a motion right now that's active in the council file system that is up for consideration. And a lot of people really like that idea because it's a really simple thing to increase transparency. Literally, schedule a few meetings after 5. Of course, there's costs associated with that, and there's, it's not just, oh, hey, I won a competition and this happened and it's great. It's a process, of course, but a lot of people were really happy that this is even up for discussion. I've encouraged a lot of neighborhood councils to consider taking a position on immigrant rights and potentially a sanctuary ordinance for Los Angeles, because we have SB 54, which is great, but I bet we could make even more of an impact if we had something locally. And also just even something smaller. There was a olive tree that was chopped down illegally on a property in my neighborhood. And there was a letter that I sent that our neighborhood council approved to send to a commission. And they actually reopened the investigation about that because they got this letter. And again, it's a small thing. It was a letter, but it actually created a result for a stakeholder who was really concerned. So.
About the olive tree get replanted?
I don't. The investigation is still happening about it, so I do need to follow up with the stakeholder to find out. But at the very least, it's being investigated. So.
Mm-hmm.
So for me as a social scientist, one of the things I always want to do is communicate the findings of my research, and I think that's an important way that one can have an impact as a scientist is to when those journalists call, to communicate with them, to write op-eds related to your research findings, and to engage with those outside audiences, and that's something that I've that's been valuable, I think, from my end as well, because now once I do that kind of engagement, I end up hearing from community organizations and foundations and others that I'll do pro bono work with, help them figure out the ways that they can do more effective advocacy. So I think it is important to do that kind of communication to kind of get outside the standard scientific practice and let people know about what you're finding in your work.
I guess the most profound and obvious from my perspective would be being at City Hall and seeing the march approaching. That was pretty incredible to see, just tens of thousands of people that just had turned up to support science. In addition to that, there's a few specific examples that I thought of that, one I already addressed in one of my earlier answers was a volunteer of ours, her son, and his history class. That meant a lot to me to find out that, of their own accord, they were recognizing the importance of science and policy. There was another just incredibly integral volunteer in the organization, Andrea Vogel, who, thank you, Jess. Jess had sent a student who worked with your nonprofit, Blueprint Earth.
Yep.
Had sent a student over to me who was going to help with kind of sorting through our massive Excel spreadsheet of volunteers. And she actually got her mom involved too. That's Andrea Vogel. And her mom ended up just completely running with the task and organized so many volunteers. And she came from the same perspective of the woman I previously mentioned, Sandra Huang, of this whole I'm a non-scientist that identifies at this point in my life as essentially a mom. What can I do to help? And she was just instrumental in getting everyone placed and ready to go. And she's doing so much autonomous work now with the organization that for me is also evidence of how this has made a difference. That a non-scientist is now having confidence in herself to really help spearhead these changes. And then one other thing that I was thinking is that on Facebook, actually, maybe not the best breeding ground for productive political conversation, but I have seen a nice trend, at least in some of the groups that I'm a part of, particularly science-minded groups, but in general I've seen this to be true as well, is that, I forget if it was Jess or Dr. Walker that had mentioned this earlier, but a lot of times you have people kind of war against each other, and they try to say, like, I'm going to force you to see that my side is true. And anyone who's ever, studied the way to formulate a successful and productive argument knows that that's not going to be effective. I've seen less of that, and I've seen more of people saying things like, I want to see your sources, cite your sources. And that makes me happy every time I see that on Facebook. It's just, even if you're just arguing about, what kind of sugars are in jelly beans and if they're safe to consume, like it's nice that people are actually saying, like, show me a source that supports what you're saying. Let's not just throw random stuff out into the ether and claim that it's true. So I think, focusing on things like the March for Science has helped in that sort of attitude.
Wait till I tell my mother that she is a non-scientist who identifies as a mom. She will be, she'll be thrilled.
And then, well, for me, I'll kind of piggyback off of Alex's, because that particular student, so I founded a nonprofit environmental science research organization called Blueprint Earth, and we do interdisciplinary field research attempting to create blueprints of the Earth in an environmental context, a very interdisciplinary framework, because essentially, I got frustrated trying to work with scientists across disciplines and realizing that we were so siloed that we were missing a lot of big picture things because we were so wrapped up in very specific details. So I said, all right, cool, geology, biology, hydrology, atmosphere, let's do this. Let's create blueprints of biomes one at a time, starting with California's Mojave Desert, because we have accessibility for students from a lot of the different higher education institutions here in SoCal. And we're also close to Las Vegas, so we get some UNLV folks as well. And this part of the Mojave Desert is amazing because we have lava flows, we have ancient lake deposits, stream deposits, and there's flowing water in the desert, which a lot of people have a mistaken impression of the desert, but there is a plethora of life out there. And I usually don't get to say plethora on the campaign trail, so yes, plethora. People get it sometimes. Sometimes I get weird looks, but there's a lot of life. And so, this program has been something I've been consumed by for the last 5 years. And when I was thinking about running for Congress, it was not because I wanted to become a politician, because I thought, well, I can affect the greatest change and do the most for our planet and for students by giving them these research opportunities and continuing to work on this interdisciplinary project. But I had students who had worked with me, such as Alicia Nygaard, who is Andrea Vogel's daughter. And Alicia, for anyone, I hope you all run into her, and I hope she's watching or sees this at some point, because she will be she'll know. But Alicia is covered in tattoos, some of which are like zombie dinosaurs. And she has gauged ears. She's got, I think she's got a facial piercing. Yeah, I think she's got one. But she is an amazing scientist. She's a field geologist, and she's super talented. And what happened was Alicia's experience with me in the field and with the other scientists we work with inspired her in a way, because she already was a geology student, but she roped her mother into the March for Science. She then, when I said I was going to run for Congress, was like, I'm telling everyone I know, and my mom and my grandma and all of their friends are going to support you. And I was like, oh God, what sort of a fire did I start? And it's not just her. Like, the work that my nonprofit has done, to me, is kind of the legacy that I would like to have. It's as a scientist. It's not as a politician. I'm not a politician. I'm a scientist. And that's the thing, is you all get to choose what your legacy will be and what you want to be seen as. And so I'd rather be a scientist who decided to dabble in politics at a time of crisis and make sure that I'm emphasizing the work that we do through science. Because to me, we just lost somebody last night who made a huge impact, an outsized impact on the scientific world and the regular world. It was the #1 trending thing on Twitter yesterday, Stephen Hawking. And for somebody who bridged that divide between science and society so well for his entire life, it really speaks to the power that we all have with our research and with what we are doing and the pursuit of knowledge. So to me, anytime that I can make a difference is a time where I'm sharing knowledge or inspiring others to seek knowledge.
Thank you. So we're going to start taking audience questions at this point. The first one we got is, scientists are very busy people. How can we convince them to carve out time for political action? Everybody want to handle that one?
It's hard. I'm just going to say it's really hard, because I don't get to go running around on volcanoes anymore. Or there are 2 expeditions coming up for my nonprofit in the next 2 weeks, and I don't get to go on either of them. So it's a big sacrifice. So if you're going to run for office, obviously that's a different thing. If you're going to do some of the activities that the other folks have mentioned, you can moderate and pace yourself a little bit more. But you should, because otherwise, who's going to fund your research if you don't?
I'm going to agree with that. It's, who's going to fund your research? If we look back, right? Look back at the recession and how that impacted science. Like, a lot of labs were shutting down at that time. A lot of people couldn't find jobs at that point in time. And I think if we make the connection for scientists about how all of these issues connect to them individually and how things really impact science and, the pursuit of knowledge and all of these things, I think we can get people to put 5 minutes a day even, if they just understand how it connects to them and what they're doing.
So to kind of answer this very literally, if you're doing some sort of political activist work and you want to get some key scientists involved in the discussion, I think, as with anyone who's very busy and successful, you want to kind of try to bring it to them, make whatever project it is as accommodating as possible for their schedule and their constraints. We, in leading up to the march, tried to do a few little video series where we interviewed some professors at Caltech, UCLA, and asked them some basic questions about science and as it pertains to policy, what their opinions were. And we just made sure to really structure it around their schedule. We came to their offices. We brought, a video and sound crew to do it, and they were all very happy to be a part of it. I doubt they would have wanted to come down to like a studio on the weekend and do it. So I think if you structure your ask, so to speak, of a given scientist, you just have to accommodate them.
And I think, the question came up before about funding for science. And, obviously we're in this time when government seems to be scaling a lot of that back. And I think that's another one of those reasons why it's just critically important to communicate broadly about your scientific findings. Especially given that a lot of the funders now, they do have these deep concerns that the message gets out there and that these government resources are used in a way that actually does help to inform policy and helps to inform debate. And so, the idea of carving out time, it doesn't necessarily need to be this kind of zero-sum game where this is time outside the lab or, time outside of your writing. This is really about kind of extending the audience and also, thinking about playing the long game in terms of how do you, help to reinforce the message that scientific funding is an important thing for government to be involved in.
So this, from my personal experience, I wrote a show called Taking Heed about global warming. And so I get a lot of feedback, if you will. But one of the things I hear is all the scientists who are, quote, sounding the alarm about global warming, it's because their funding is coming from that, right? So how do you avoid that? Just getting them to fight for their funding and then people saying, oh, well, they're saying what they need to get their funding.
My student loans show that I'm not paid off to talk about climate change. I'm just saying. And actually, that's funny because my own father, who is Republican, has taken to posting on Facebook when his Republican friends criticize my videos that he shares or whatever. They say, "Oh, she's global warming is a conspiracy. Climate change isn't real. They're all paid." My dad's like, "No, Jess has like $50,000 in student debt still. She's not getting paid off." And I tell people, there's no big green. Like it'd be great if there were, but there isn't. And that's the thing is that you just show people like, look, I'm studying terrestrial snails. Like, where's the terrestrial snail lobby? So you kind of you kind of have to explain why you're interested in what you're doing. And if you can't explain to other people why you're studying that, then maybe you shouldn't be studying that thing. So understand where your passion comes from, because that's part of science communication.
I think there's also a popular misunderstanding about what research grants actually do. Like, I think a lot of members of the public think that you're taking a salary or something, and that it's not going to fund the project. When it's like, well, yes, it's going to fund additional research on this important topic, which I think is a legitimate thing, and I think most people would agree is a legitimate thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, my field of research, the funding for climate change research has no bearing whatsoever on how much money we get, and that doesn't stop me from being a shill for climate change. But I think that comes down to the wall of, do I believe fact as fact, and I'm still not certain how we break through that.
Well, and it's like people, sometimes we hear what we want to hear. And I think I think the general public just doesn't fully understand how science is funded in general. And, maybe we need to do a better job as scientists of explaining those dynamics about, what relationships we have with grants and how that all works. And perhaps the conversation would change if the general public is open to hearing about how that will work.
Next question from the audience. Is an evidence-based training sufficient to navigate competing interests in politics? Jess, I think that's calling you out.
I would say yes, actually. And because, this is not even me talking as a scientist. This is me talking as Jess before science. I was actually a history major as an undergrad. Yes, I know. Humanities, huh? But, what we see is that, if you have a strong message that is based in fact, whether or not you're a scientist, like, people will eventually hew to that fact. It's just a matter of presenting it and being clear about it and making sure that people understand where you're getting your information from and what your real purpose is. So I think that it all just ties back into the, come at it from a position of earnestness. Don't be disingenuous. Don't try to sugarcoat what you're doing either. Tell people the truth and expect that they can handle it. And ask them to meet you somewhere that is true. And if they truly disagree, they'll tell you. They're not going to be shy, especially not in this day and age. So I think what you have to do is just take that broad perspective, which is, we have this special relationship with evidence and facts as scientists, but at the end of the day, what it boils down to is what you're proposing good for the people you're proposing it for? And can you get them to understand that it is? And that's what you have to do in politics.
I touched on it a little bit before, why are people in STEM, well suited to public office? Again, when you're sitting on a board that makes advisory decisions on policy, you need to have the right data to make the decision. And you can tell people that. You can tell people who come to you wanting a decision from you, wanting a vote on something, for or against or whatever, that they need to give you information so that, you can really discern the right story about what's actually happening and about what you're deciding on. And most people will respect that, whether they agree with whatever decision you make or not. At a certain point, if they want you to be on the same page as them, they are usually happy to give you the information that you're looking for.
The question was, is evidence-based training enough to resolve political differences or something to that extent?
That's close enough.
Yeah. My answer is no. I find it impossibly unlikely that every single member of Congress doesn't know what evidence-based policy is. I think the vast majority, if not all of them, know when they're going against fact. And so I think that one solution is getting scientists, people who are coming from a very scientific method kind of approach to policy is important. But I think equally important is making sure that the structure of the way policy is made in Congress is different. The allowances for things like insider training among members of Congress and their staff should not exist, and that's what's allowing our government to essentially pursue courses of action that fly in the face of both their constituents and the evidence. And so there was recently, I think it was Princeton that had dug into like 3 decades of data on a wide spectrum of issues that that policy was made in reference to over the course of this time period. And they made an incredibly simple but informative plot. And on the x-axis, you basically had what the policy was and its chance of being passed. And on the y, you had the public's interest in that policy being passed. And so you'd expect, as you go towards something that has a higher likelihood of passing, it would also correlate with a higher interest of the general public in that policy passing. So you'd expect a nice linear line up, right? So if everybody hates this policy, then obviously the politicians aren't going to implement it. And if everybody loves it, they'd be stupid not to. But what you get in actuality is a flat line. You get a completely flat line. There's no correlation whatsoever whether you as the constituents who elected this person into office want them to make this policy or not. They're going to do what they're going to do. And what's interesting is if you modify this data set and you look at, I believe it was the top 5% of earners in the United States, you look at their interests, then you have a nice linear increase. So that's the problem, is that money is dictating our policy and not evidence.
I mean, I think one of the other issues here is, not just about evidence, but about like how receptive our audience is to hearing evidence. I think that's something that we're at a moment of reckoning about this right now, I think. There's just a study that came out of the MIT Media Lab just this past week looking at how, this fake news misinformation, like it spreads, to a broader audience and much more quickly than things that are more fact-based. And so, not to write off social media entirely, but you worry about like, if we're relying on social media so heavily for our communication now, especially when social media is by design people who you've opted in to hear from, who tend to be people who are most similar to you in a whole set of a variety of metrics, then it makes you think about how it's really important not just to do evidence-based work, but also to really go out of your way to try to communicate outside of your normal communication bubbles. And I think that's part of why it also makes a lot of sense to be doing a lot of offline engagement where people are often much more listening to reason, and they will communicate with a human being in a way that they will communicate in a different way from some online message that they're exposed to for a short period.
Well, that's an important lesson. Talk to people face to face.
Hey.
All right, we have our first question from online. Going on that topic, what should be the priority of organizations like 314? Bringing empiricism to politics or being an interest group for scientists? How would this affect any prudent approach? This is from Ryan Lennon on Twitter.
I think leading back to the conversation we just had, I think we need to focus on getting people more engaged just in general. And I think we also need to focus on getting more people who, would actually make evidence-based decisions into office. And I think it's just really important to have people who are not going to be driven by special interest money when it comes to their decision making. We need to get those kinds of people elected.
I think this is pretty tricky territory because I think either both initiatives can further distance, I think it kind of harkens back to the preaching of the choir concept that Dr. Walker was talking about, is that those who are already disagreeing with the sentiments of the people in this room and on this panel are not going. You're not going to reach through to them by establishing what essentially is going to be seen by them as your own special interest group. So I would say focus more on actually getting the person there, because the person can prove by their policy record and their mettle that they're there for the right reasons and that they're following a course of action that people can get behind.
Nothing else to add?
I agree.
All right, good. We'll get one more from online. We have to wrap this up fairly soon, but this one comes from Xander Bernstein on Twitter. Scientists are by necessity an intellectual elite. How do scientists/politicians remove the stigma of elitism?
Oh my God, can I say something? Is it okay? Okay. So this is actually something, and I look kind of at Alex vaguely for that, because last year at the March for Science, I gave a talk at the very end of the day. So if you were there at the very, very end, that was me. And I, in that talk, mentioned how that we are all born as scientists. So the idea that scientists are some sort of like super meta uber humans, like we're not. We are normal people with an outsized amount of curiosity that didn't get squeezed out of us as we grew up. So everybody is a scientist fundamentally, because we are all testing hypotheses about the world around us. It's just that those of us with degrees in science have taken it to sort of an unusual level. And is particularly, again, if you're studying terrestrial snails. I'm saying this because I'm hoping that my friend who's a terrestrial snail guy is watching. But no, it's, and also it's just really funny to say that that's what you study. But I think that it really, you just have to remind people, drag it out of their memory if you have to, but remind them of that curiosity that they all were born with. And that's really how you connect, even with people who may have not had a scientific thought in years, is you say, just remember wondering why the sky was blue? Even people who've had really traumatic childhoods, which a lot of people did. A lot of people didn't have much time as children, and it's really unfortunate. But there was a point where everybody had some curiosity within them. And I think that is actually the most special thing we can do as scientists, is to remind the world about why science is so cool, about what makes us different. And it's because of all the species on the planet, at least that we know so far, humans are the only ones who actually question the world around us in the way that we do and try to find answers. So we have a pretty unique place here, so we might as well use it. And that means not being elitist. That means telling people, encouraging people, hey, citizen science is really neat. And, you can actually ask questions that need answering. It's not just reserved for people with a bunch of letters after our names. It's for everyone.
Well, my cat also asks questions about the world, so you can see it. See it in her face.
I think a lot of the answer to that question has to do with, we're at this kind of anti-elitist, anti-expert moment right now, which has a lot to do with the fact that we also have levels of income inequality that are rivaling the Gilded Age of the United States. And so, a lot of that is tied up in concerns about social class. And so, here at UCLA, we've got this project called First to Go, which has been highlighting the fact that a huge number of our faculty are actually the first in their family to go to college. And I've been involved in that. A number of my colleagues in various units on campus have been involved in it. And I think that's really important to communicate, to let people know that scientists come from a lot of different backgrounds. Scientists are from different international areas. From diverse in huge numbers of ways. Race, ethnicity, gender, LGBT. I think it's worth recognizing that diversity of scientists, in all those ways. And I think that kind of helps to break down this image of scientists.
Yeah, I guess I just fundamentally disagree with the premise of the question. There is no intellectual elitism. I would love for you to have seen in the past 2 years the number of stupid things I've done in a given day that anyone in a research lab does. They're literally every day you're not doing science if you didn't do something that you're looking over your shoulder oh my God, I hope nobody saw that. There's no elitism. It's just that we've decided to get in often very involved in a very nuanced question that most people in the world don't care about. That doesn't mean that we're some elitist group. I would say in the vast majority of cases, especially at an activism level, the non-scientists that worked with the March for Science had the most to bring to the table and get the ball rolling. So,
Well, and you know, I think it all just comes down to really just never losing touch with who you are. You know, what would you do if you weren't doing science, right? Or you know, science and what people are thinking about. And you know, like Jess said, we were all born scientists. We experiment, and every day we do things differently. No 2 days are alike. And I think if we just remain, you know, do our best to never really lose who we are as people, and really just, you know, engage, be authentic, and be honest, and, you know, live your life, then I think people will just start thinking differently about, you know, scientists as people in general. They won't look at us as, you know, people who they can't have a conversation with. They won't associate the word elite, because they'll just see authentic human beings who are just like them. And, you know, they won't place themselves or us, you know, people who chose this as a career, you know, in a other sort of position in their minds.
But I think Jess had a good point earlier, which is subconscious, which is a lot of the elitism comes from the language associated with science. And she says, I don't use the word plethora when I'm talking in the public, because
I
people
realize that I actually
don't like it when
do.
they don't understand what you're saying.
Yeah, no, but I mean, yeah, we do self-censor at times, but you know, and I'll tell people, yeah, I do cosmogenic nuclide dating, and they're like, and then I'm like, but let me explain it to you. Cosmic rays bombarding the planet. Like that's what you have to do, is if you find yourself falling into that sort of science speak, just remember to normalize it. And again, if you can't explain it in plain English, like that's a problem. And maybe you guys have heard of the Dance Your Thesis program, where they like take people from all different fields and you have to like do interpretive dance to communicate what your research is about. Like, even if you're not going to do it, think about it. Like, how would you communicate your research to somebody through dance? I mean, just challenge yourself, because yeah, you may be amazing at your particular field. You may be the #1 person in the world at that thing, but if you can't communicate it, like, what good is it? So.
and whatever that thing is that Jess said, I have no idea what that is. Like,
You really should.
across fields, like, yeah, the jargon is like mind-boggling across fields. So.
It's pretty cool. Come ask me if you want it about cosmogenic nuclide dating. It's great. It's not Tinder.
No, and I mean, just to that point, I actually rarely lead with, you know, with the fact that, oh yeah, I'm a scientific researcher, I'm a scientist. I actually rarely lead with that being what I like, identifying myself as that. I usually talk about other things first, and then, you know, in that process, people ask what I do, and I have my explanation, my really simple explanation, and depending on their curiosity, you know, a real conversation. Like, you know, I kind of gauge what their interest level is in hearing, you know, what I do, and I go from there. If they don't seem like that's their jam, that's cool. We don't have to talk about flow cytometry. We don't. Lasers.
I mean, it is
Lasers. But no, who doesn't want to talk about lasers? I always want to talk about lasers. I'm just saying.
Exactly.
there are
That's what I
efforts-
lead with when I talk about my work.
There are efforts to try to get scientists to do jargon-free ways of communicating. I mean, something I've been involved in is a project called the Scholar Strategy Network, where, you know, scholars can, you know, post information about their research, and then, you know, you can post a policy brief about your research, and you're required to actually do it in a very jargon-free way, and that can get picked up by, you know, a whole range of broader audiences. And there's actually a Los Angeles chapter of this, if any of you are interested, that meets from time to time and tries to find ways of connecting scientists who are doing policy-relevant work with policymakers and with journalists who are writing about this. So the no jargon thing is definitely important.
Yeah, you know, I was on another panel at Berkeley, and one of the guys did a history podcast, and he said something that I think is very important to scientists as well. He was a historian, but he's like, people don't want the dumbed-down version of history. They want the full history, but they want you to explain it to them in simple terms that they can understand. And I think they want the same thing with science. And if you don't, you seem like you're an elitist who doesn't care whether or not they understand. They don't. And
You know, there was a Tumblr, I don't know if it's still around, but it had to do with like your thesis title, and you had to like explain it in a dumb way. And I mean, you know, instead of lava flow morphologies, I was like rock shapes. You know, like, I mean, so I mean, it just makes you think, like, what am I actually talking about even? And I think that's the important thing.
All right, we have another question from the audience. How can we build greater civic engagement and critical thinking into science education at the university level?
I think one component is destigmatizing it. There was something that I was a little concerned about getting involved in the March for Science. I didn't know how my PI was going to take it. I didn't know how my department was going to take it. I'm on a fellowship, which is NIH funded, so it feels sort of conflict of interesty to like be pursuing a political action while I'm getting money for the government. But I think to help address that stigma, you have to help students and faculty alike to reconcile that science is not exclusive of politics, and just because you're involved in politics and you want it to be scientifically driven does not mean that that you're necessarily partisan in that action.
Go ahead, please.
Oh no, just real. I think just within science education and higher levels, I think it should be more interdisciplinary. Like I'm actually a scientist with an MBA, and that's actually the skills that I use in the lab. Just the way my job has worked out are actually really related to having an MBA. It made sense for me to go that route, and I think maybe management training for PhDs would be great. It would, because you have to manage a lab. If you're a PI, it's not just unfortunately, you can't just go in and do whatever project you're doing. You have to do a lot of paperwork. You have to do a lot of other things, and so that just adding some of that stuff into the curriculum.
What I would say is, we've mostly been talking about this in terms of individual level things that scientists can do, but this is also about the structure of the university. This isn't just on scientists to, through individual acts of will and engagement to make these changes on their own. I mean, this is about how university rewards certain kinds of engagement. And, so if universities, wanted to support this kind of thing, I mean, these are the kinds of things that could come up in promotion and tenure reviews. They could come up in other ways, and not in the way of like, okay, did you say the right political thing, or we're not going to tenure you. Not that kind of thing at all, which is terrifying. But I'm thinking of the kind of thing where, like, yes, your public engagement. How much have you done to communicate the results of your research to broader audiences? Which is an important part of science, and I think it's something that universities should recognize more.
All right. Well, thank you. We're running short on time here, so we're going to wrap it up here. I'm going to ask the final question, if we could just keep the answers short. Everyone's here because they want to affect change. How can they do that?
Show up. Literally just show up.
And speak out, whether you mean, hopefully if you're here, you don't have a crippling social anxiety, but some people do. So, I mean, I'm not joking. Like I have friends who really hate being out in public and hate talking on the phone. Well, then email, text. There are so many tools we have now to use your voice. Like use it. There's no excuse not to. And if you don't feel informed, use that science training you have and do some research and figure out where you stand about at least just one thing and then make it happen.
I occasionally have crippling social anxiety. So, if you're, I keep touching on this, but if you're passionate enough about it, you'll get through things like that. Who cares if you're sweaty and nervous and fidgety? Like, people will see that you care about the thing, and they'll start to care about the thing too. And yeah, show up.
I think it's so important to start small and to find some way that you can engage in a meaningful local way, and that could be as simple as talking about the findings of your research. It could be engaging in a wide range of other things. And what we know about a lot of effective social movements is that you often start small and then you scale up, and then you never really know where it's going to go from the beginning, but there's only one way to find out.
All right. Well, thank you all for doing that. I think one thing that maybe we didn't touch on is that, people dislike self-promotion. And by the way, you can find me on Facebook, tim.x.lee. You'll see me there, and you can see Taking Heat in Hollywood this summer. I'll be right near there. Anyway, I want to thank you guys all for taking the time to come share your wisdom with everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the panel.
And let's have another round of applause for a great moderator, Tim Lee. That concludes the event. Please stick around. We're going to have snacks and beverages outside and a little mixer for a while. You have a chance to meet the panelists and maybe talk to them for a bit. So please stick around. Thank you.